Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This is episode number 20 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. My name is Jason Romano. Thank you so much for being a part of our program today. As always, you can subscribe and download the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, everywhere podcasts are found, as well as at sportsspectrum.com, where we post daily content, daily devotionals, including the podcast and all sorts of great content for you to check out. It's all there at sportsspectrum.com. Today's guest on the show is Louie Giglio. He is a pastor, he is a founder, and he is a church planter, and he is an author. And his latest book is called Goliath Must Fall, Winning the Battle Against Your Giants by Louie Giglio. And we are going to give you a chance to win a copy of Louie's latest book. It's a fantastic book, Winning the Battles Against Your Giants, Goliath Must Fall. I hold it in my hand right now, and there's some sound effects for you. 240 pages of really just awesome goodness. And we're going to give away a copy of this book to you at the end of the podcast. So stay tuned to listen how you can win your copy of Louie Giglio's latest book, Goliath Must Fall, Winning the Battle Against Your Giants. But Louie Giglio, I mean, if you don't know who he is the founder and pastor of Passion City Church down in Atlanta, Georgia. He's also the founder of the Passion Movement. And of course, that conference that they do in the beginning of the year, which is geared towards young people. And I mean like college-age kids, 50,000 people strong gathering at the Atlanta, Georgia Dome this past January to worship, to seek, to learn, and to just really sort of search inside themselves about what God is doing in their lives and what the future holds and who Jesus Christ is. And it's just really great stuff that Pastor Louie is doing. And so I'm excited to bring his story to you. This is episode 20. Here is our conversation with Pastor Louie Giglio, author of the new book, Goliath Must Fall. Louie, how are you?
Jason, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. It's great to have you on. And I got to ask you, because the first thing that came to my mind as I was doing my research, and I know how big of a sports fan you are, and you're living in Atlanta. We're about 5 months removed now. Super Bowl 51, I know you were there at the game. Have you been able to get over the loss to the Patriots and kind of everything that happened in that game?
You know, I don't think Atlanta's ever going to get over the loss in the Super Bowl. Atlanta hasn't had a championship for a while in any major sport. So we were very, very close. And, if you live in New England, that's kind of a regular occurrence. But if you live in Atlanta, Georgia, it's pretty rare air. So we were all, had high expectations, high hopes. But secondly, I'd been with the team a few times leading right up to the Super Bowl, and I actually did chapel for the Falcons the night before the game. And so, if anybody knows anything about sports ministry, that's just all a convoluted web, because God doesn't pick winners and losers. There are guys on both sides of the field who are believing in the same Jesus, praying to the same God, wanting to live their lives for him. But at the same time, you feel a lot of pressure if you're the chapel guy.
Yeah, right.
Win, it's awesome. If you lose, you're never heard from again, So that's on the line, and I'm watching God work in the lives of guys. And selfishly, and I guess people would understand this on your show, but selfishly, I'm praying. Lord, I know you work in both wins and losses, but this guy really is tracking with you right now, and I pray he'd play to the very best of his ability in this game, and maybe do something special that he'll know that you touched his life in a special way. So that's in the mix. And then we get up, and I think we got a 28-3 score. Mm-hmm. The Patriots fans are in shock, literal shock, not figurative. They're literally sitting there in shock. And then to sit there and watch Brady go to work on a very tired defense, it was deflating with a capital D. And I honestly don't want to talk much more about it.
I'll try not to bring it up. I apologize. But I did kind of look and see, oh, you know what? Louie wrote a book called The Comeback. So it kind of takes on a different meaning now. after that game, right?
Oh man, I heard from some New England people, and they're like, "Well, obviously the Patriots have read Louie's book," and I was like, "Hey, don't go there."
We're talking to Louie Giglio. He's the pastor of Passion City Church in Atlanta and the author of the book Goliath Must Fall. We'll talk about that book in a moment. But Louie, I want to go back a little bit. You have a master's in theology, a doctorate in ministry, but you didn't plant your own church until 2009. And on that church planting journey with you was former NFL kicker Todd Peterson. Now, Todd is a member of the ministry that helps serve with Sports Spectrum Pro Athletes Outreach. And in talking to Todd, I was fascinated to find out the story behind that. I'd like you to share that with our listeners, how you got connected with Todd as you began the process of starting Passion City Church.
Yeah, well, both were two really amazing and wonderful gifts from God. The church, was just a really, from a human standpoint, a completely backwards idea. I was 50 years old. We had a ministry called Passion already for almost 20 years. I'd been serving college students around the world. Passion had done events in 17, 18, 20 countries around the world. We'd had millions, literally millions of college students attend Passion gatherings and arenas and football stadiums and athletic fields and concert halls all over the country and around the world. And at 50 years old, God starts nudging my heart and saying to me, not at 50, actually around 45, he starts nudging my heart to say, I want you to plant a local church. And I'm like, you got to be kidding. Why didn't you say that to me 20 years ago? And when I finally was able to hear, understand, and obey, and, those are the key things in life, to hear God, to understand what he's saying, and then to obey what he's saying, that's the thing all of us shoot for every day in life. And it took me a few years to do that. And I would say, I'm sad to say it took me a few years, but it was a big decision to make, and I was unwinding, Jason, some things that honestly had been spoken into my life when I was 30 years old, and I won't get way into that story today, but at a casual lunch after a youth event where I'd spoken, a guy says across the table, so I guess I will tell you real fast.
Oh, please.
He says, so Louie, what are your plans long-term for your life? And I'm like, okay, that's a big question, and I'm thinking about my answer, and before I can answer, another youth leader at the table answers, and he says, well, I'll tell you one thing he's not going to do. And I thought, okay, well, I'm totally listening now because you know what I'm not going to do in life. I would like to know what I'm not going to do in life. And he says, I'll tell you one thing Louie's not going to do. He's never going to be the pastor of a local church. And at the time, I didn't want to be the pastor of a local church. I was 30. We'd started a campus ministry at Baylor. I was traveling and speaking a lot, and I liked my life, and I really wasn't angling to become pastor at the church on the corner. And I didn't say anything. I kind of shrugged my shoulders. And the other guy, so now these two guys are having a conversation about my future. The other guy says, well, why do you say that? And he says, well, I'll tell you why. It's just because of Louie's gifts and the way he speaks. It would never fit with a congregation week after week after week. Louie's going to be a voice to the church around the world. And you really honestly, you couldn't have somebody like Louie every single Sunday. And I think that was a compliment and a not a compliment at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I remember just in my mind, I didn't say a word at the table. In my mind, I said, oh, okay, so I'm not going to be a local church pastor. Well, fine, I don't want to be. Well, at 45, God started breaking into my life and saying, Louie, I want you to plant a church. I want you to take this passion movement, which is this global movement, and I want you to back it all the way down to a local expression of faith in the city of Atlanta. And I said, God, but I'm not going to be a local church pastor. Remember the guy at lunch, when I was 30? And it took 5 years, Jason, for me to really get my head and heart all the way around the fact that God never said that to me. That guy said that to me. And I hope people listening to us today can be encouraged by that, because a lot of times a parent or a spouse or a friend will say something over our lives, and we'll just assume that's God speaking over our lives. We'll take it at face value and sort of chalk it up to that's the way things are going to be. And we really have to be careful how much weight we let other people's opinions have in our lives. And God was so clear and gracious in saying, Louie, I didn't say that to you. I never said that to you. That guy, and I don't even know that guy's name, that guy said that to you. And so what I'm saying to you is I want you to plant a church, and at 50 years of age, we stepped out in faith, Shelley and I did, with a team of people, and Todd and Susan were right there with us. I'd met Todd at our former church. We both attended the same church before. And one Sunday when Todd was living in Atlanta but playing for the 49ers out in California, he walked up to me one day and said, "Hey, I'm Todd Peterson, and I just really have this vision that, you and Andy are going to come to PAO and share together at our conference next year." And I was like, "Man, it's great to meet you." So we started a friendship to that day. He's now on the board of our ministry, overseeing all things passion and helping give a lot of leadership to that with us. And what a gift, because I've gotten to know PAO and the incredible things that God is doing through the organization that you're connected to. And I'm a local church pastor now. Lo and behold, that guy was wrong.
Well,
and God was right. And we're 8
story.
years into Passion City Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and having the time of our lives.
That's such a great story. We're talking to Louie Giglio here. He is the pastor, as he said, of Passion City Church, founded in 2009. Now, Louie, you and I met, as you mentioned, at PAO at the Increase Conference a few years ago outside of Atlanta. And I saw how your words and your message really connected with these athletes that were in attendance. Why do you think sports and faith or being a follower of Jesus melt so well, like intersect so well?
Well, I don't know exactly how to get to the heart of that, but I do know that, I have a love of sports, of all sports. I follow some really random sports and try to keep up with a lot of things going on globally because we have friends all around the world. So I'm tracking the Indian cricket league, which that's a sport for a lot of people listening. You can Google it.
Sure.
But I've got friends on the South Africa cricket team. In South Africa, obviously, they're one of the 6 big cricket teams in the world, and they have a pro league in India in the summer. Most of these guys are marquee players on different teams in different cities in India. So, I've got the app for the Indian cricket league up on my phone half the time, checking and seeing how guys are doing. But I love sports. But I also have a heart for people in sports, especially at the highly competitive level of pro sports, because it is a glamorous life on the outside and the surface, but it's a very, very challenging life in reality. And it's a tough place to live in, and to be really honest, and this, and a lot of your listeners do, but when you succeed in any sphere of life, but especially in a visible way, there all of a sudden a lot of takers gather around. And what you need the most is a true voice, someone who loves you, who doesn't want something from you except God's best, and who will be honest with you and stay with you through thick and thin, who will ride the highs and the lows, because every athlete has both. Even LeBron James has nights where he really stinks it up, and then he has nights where he's LeBron James. And teams go through high seasons and low seasons, and guys and girls in sports need that reflection of God in their world. And what is that? It's somebody who loves them for who they are, who's committed to God's very best in them and willing to be a friend and tell them what they honestly need to hear and encourage them, and somebody that is the same, whether they're winning or whether they're not winning. And God has given me a great love of sports, but a real particular love for guys and girls in sport. And over the last 30 years, I've had some extraordinary opportunities to step into different arenas, but I think I've had, by the grace of God, the opportunity to do it, without ever asking for an autograph or wanting to get a photograph or wanting to get anything. Free tickets to something is to say, I'm here to tell you that God loves you, to remind you that he has a plan for you, and to encourage you to become everything God can make you into. And I don't know, I think those guys have a competitive fire. I have a competitive fire about the kingdom and about what I'm doing in life.
Sure.
And I think there's some kind of synergy in that, that attracts like. And for whatever reason, it's been a real joy to be in some of those spaces.
Is it possible, Louie, for an athlete, especially not world class, but a famous athlete, really famous, to be ingrained in a local church and serve? I know that's one of the things I've talked about with some of the athletes I've worked with in my time at ESPN and now with Sports Spectrum, is just the want and the need to be plugged into a local church, but because they're so known by so many people, it makes it very difficult to sort of just live that normal life going to church. Is that possible in your eyes?
I think it is possible, but it's extraordinarily difficult. And it can happen, but it has to be a team commitment from the leaders of that church, not just the pastor, but I would say if a church like Passion City Church, our top 30 leaders have to be bought into that vision. And then the core of our serving core. So in our church, that would be a couple thousand people. And then the person, the athlete, all three components have to make a commitment to making that process work. And that's where, in my opinion, it breaks down, because a lot of pastors I know love having celebrities and athletes in their church, and they make a big deal out of it, and they let everybody know that they're there, and they take it and exploit it. And then you got a lot of leadership people, and I mean, before long, they're trying to get free tickets to the game and trying to get a photo or this or that or the other. And I think that everybody has to buy in together the process. And if so, it can work, but it's very rare. And, we have an athlete in our church in the off season, which for her, her sport plays this time of year. She's a professional. She's actually one of the best in the world in her sport. And then she also will play overseas in the off season. And so she normally isn't in town but a few weeks out of the year. But this year she didn't play overseas. And so she was here for several months to start the year. And I walk into one of the gatherings on one Sunday and look up in the choir, and there she is in the choir, just bleeding out strong.
Great.
And I was like, that's unbelievable. It's one of the best. This is an Olympic gold medal winning athlete, a champion, MVP, college champion, high school champion. She wins. That's all I say about her is she wins. And there she is in the choir because she made that commitment, and the choir allowed her to make that commitment, and our team allowed her to make that commitment. And I don't remember one Sunday that anyone on the platform turned around and said, "Hey, everybody, it's gold medal winning, national champion, blah, 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 so-and-so in the choir today." We just let her be. And if that commitment comes on every angle, it can happen. I mean, there are very high-profile athletes in our gatherings regularly, but it's very, very rare that any of them get mentioned. But we do know how to look after them. We know how to buffer them, not cater to them, but buffer them so that they can come and worship and have that experience. So I would encourage any pastors, leaders listening to this right now, lay down the whole famous person came to our church and try to create a cocoon where they can be normal. And if you're an athlete, you're going to have to try. You got to put some effort out, and but it's worth it at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's the thing, because there's so many, the lifestyle that they live, the life they live, the vocation that they're in is so not normal, and they're treated as people that we worship and we love and we root for, and in some cases we boo and all that, and then they just want to be normal and they just want to fit in, and especially in a church setting where they should just be able to come in and sit and worship the Lord and hear a message and fellowship, and it's just very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do.
Yeah, well, we got a former Cy Young award-winning pitcher who's retired now and still in broadcasting and a legend in this city. Former Atlanta Brave, and he and his wife come to church here regularly. And I'd always hear, "Did you know so-and-so is at church today?" I'm like, "No." And they said, "Yeah, so-and-so saw him in overflow." And then 2 weeks later, so-and-so was at church again. And I said, "Great. Yeah, they were in overflow." And the overflow they were in today was just in the hallway. We don't have great overflow. Yeah. And I'm like, well, they could park in the back and come in the back, or people bothering them when they're coming in, because we just trying to mitigate that, and we live in a superstar culture in America, even in the church. Yeah. And it's different than other countries. I'm in the church in Australia and England and other places, South Africa. An athlete would walk into church, no one would dare go up to them and take a photograph of them in church. It's just not culturally cool. But in America, we're taking pictures of the worship leader at church, if he's a certain person, or the pastor. Yeah. And it's just hard to navigate around. And so I said, "Hey, they can park in the back, whatever. And they said, "Oh, we've offered that to them 5 different times, but they want to ride the shuttle and they want to walk in the front door just like everybody else." And so I admire that. Sometimes it's not practical, but I do admire that attitude. And, we've got artists here in our house. David Crowder leads worship at our church, and Christian Stanfield, the Passion Band guys. We've had Matt Redman in the past, part of our house, and other artists. And I say, you know what, God has anointed you and favored you, just like he has an athlete to do what they do. But at the same time, you can carry your bag just like I can carry mine. And yes, we'll give you a place to park where you don't have to fight through the masses, because that's just going to complicate things for everybody. But you have to lower yourself just a notch. And I see guys doing that here in our church. We've got people who come here who don't want to sit on the first 3 rows. They want to sit 25 rows back. They want to blend in. They go drop their kids off at Passion Kids, and they go pick them up at Bloom. And I think that's my encouragement to any athlete, no matter how successful you are. You can make it work by becoming what we all want to become, and that's humble. And that's what athletes need. You know, it's a tough, lonely grind.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very tough world to live in. It's not glamorous. It's actually incredibly challenging and got pitfalls all over the place, no matter who you are. And so the best thing we can do is to do everything we can to make a place in the body of Christ for people. And if it looks a little bit like we've got special rules for them, I'll take that hit any day. I'll make it easy for them, but obviously we're not going to treat them at the end of the day differently than anyone else. And I think, honestly, at the end of the day, that's the way they want it.
Absolutely. We're talking to Louie Giglio here, pastor of Passion City Church in Atlanta. His new book, Goliath Must Fall, is out now. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But I want to ask you, Louie, you mentioned sort of the sports landscape of how you're connected sort of in the wacky world of cricket and all these different areas around the world. But when I go to your Instagram page, it's clear how much you love the Auburn Tigers. So I want to find out about how you got connected with the Tigers and being just part of all that they're doing.
I'm the son of Louie Giglio the second, or junior in his case, who graduated from Auburn in 1958. He's in heaven now. And so when I grew up in our home, this is before, the ESPN. This is before, I know people are like, what? This is before SEC Network and Fox Sports South. This is when there was 3 channels on television and TBS wasn't even around yet. And if you wanted to hear Auburn play Tennessee on a Saturday, you had to listen to it on the radio. And that's what we did at our house. And it was me, my dad, and mostly my sister, and we were glued to the speakers. And we ran around on the sofa and the chairs and danced on the coffee table when we scored. And we threw things across the room and ran out the door and sulked when we lost. And that's the way I grew up. And my dad took me to Georgia Tech games when I was a kid, and so I loved Tech early. But as soon as I went to Jordan-Hare Stadium for the first time when I was about 9 years old, I went, oh, this is real football. No knock on Georgia Tech. That's real football also. But I was like, this is it. And Auburn has run through my veins all those times. And, as God would have it, about 3 different times in the last 30 years, I've intersected with the team. Different coaches, different regimes, different players. It's in the mix for a few years, not so much for a few. And for the last, 7 years now, I've been back in the mix with our team, serving our chaplain and our coach and our athletic director and our players just as a volunteer. And do a lot of our chapels on Friday night and at all of our games I can be at, home and away, on Saturday, which is pretty challenging. But it's because I'm an Auburn guy deep down, and I really don't like Alabama. I mean, it's real, But I do love them as brothers and sisters in faith, even though they've made choices that, obviously they'll have to be accountable for later in life. But I love them. I love you, Alabama people. And I respect you, but I'm an Auburn guy, and I love that team, and I love our players and coaches, and I love our staff.
That's awesome. Now tell me about, I saw recently you were at the U.S. Open in Wisconsin. What's that experience like, being at one of golf's most prestigious events?
It's intimidating, I'll tell you that. We've known a few golfers over the years, and actually know several of the golfers now. There's so many wonderful people out on the PGA Tour, and some really strong Jesus followers on tour. I mean, really, really amazing people who love God, genuinely love His Word, want to live their lives for Him. And interestingly, we were in South Africa 2 Februaries ago doing an event in a rugby stadium there, a huge event, 40,000 people. And someone said, hey, Charles Schwartzel and his wife, Rosalind, are here. And I was like, okay. great. I know Charles Schwartzel because he won the Masters, and I live in Georgia, and everybody knows who won the Masters, and I follow golf pretty closely, so I was like, that's so cool. And afterwards, we got a chance to meet, and our short conversation turned into me caddying for him at the three-par tournament at the Masters last year, which was coming up about 2 months after this meeting. And backstory, I think Charles is okay with me telling this. They live in America and in South Africa. He's South African, and he was playing in a tournament in Pretoria where the event was, and he was in the middle of the tournament while we had this event on a Friday night, and his family was saying, we're going to go. And I don't really know if he wanted to go or not, but he ended up getting loaded up, and here they came to this big event. But it was great. We just kind of hit it off, and next few months later, I was at the Wednesday three-par caddying with him and Louie Oosthuizen and Trevor Immelman, two other South Africans, and he didn't do great at that Masters, but we stayed in touch and stayed friends. They've been here in Atlanta. And then we were back at the Masters this year together. He had a great run, came in third, played amazing. And just on a whim, we kind of moved some things around last week to head up to Erin Hills. And, man, I tell you, if you want to respect some people, just watch him play this guy. This is a monster of a course, completely overpowering. Length, the accuracy you have to have in your shot selection, precision. But at the end of the day, the guys, kind of tamed at the golf course. I think a rain shower in the middle of it helped out a lot. But just being there with Charles and his family and trying to be in that place again of encouraging him, cheering him on, just trying to be a support to them. It's a really, really amazing thing. And to watch golf from the inside and to see, I already knew golf was a very complicated sport, but to watch it from the inside, to have some skin in the game, not that obviously I got any skin in the game, but I care a lot about Charlotte and their family. And, you take it hard when he doesn't play good, but you're glad you're there and you want to speak into it the same. And the thing that really stuck out to me, Jason, is that, that tournament, I'll get the number wrong, but I would guess there were 126, 130 guys that started that tournament Thursday. And, as everybody knows in golf, half of those are going to go home on Friday night, and the half that went home are some really, really good golfers. But it just kind of puts it in the spotlight again. Professional sports is really, really hard. It doesn't matter what sport it is, and it's a very, very challenging environment, and it's a tough world to navigate. And I can preach a bad sermon on Sunday, but I don't get cut. And I don't get benched. If nobody comes in and says, "Okay, that just didn't work," so we're putting this other guy in next Sunday. It's a tough world to live in, and I love whether it's golf or NASCAR with Trevor Bain, who's a really close friend of ours, or Corver, who's a part of our family here, plays for the Cavaliers now, or the cricket guys, or whether it's Lauren Davis, who's a female tennis player playing at Wimbledon next week. These are all relationships that God has cultivated, and I love serving these men and women, and our house loves serving them, cheering them on in faith.
Well, another thing you love serving is young people, college-aged young people, and since 1997, Passion has gathered collegiate-age young people in events across the U.S. and, like you said earlier, around the world. And most recently, Passion 2017 gathered more than 55,000 students in Atlanta's Georgia Dome in one of the largest collegiate gatherings in its history. I want you to just share with us your heart for young people and the Passion Conference, what it is and why it got started.
Yeah, I just got a shudder went through me when you even said that. 55,000 college-age young people in a football stadium because they love Jesus. And so I know, all the statistics say that millennials are bailing on faith and leaving the church, but let's just remember that God is still at work in this generation. And it all started for us actually kind of like the church did, the story we told earlier, a little bit by accident. I went to grad school at Baylor University after seminary, and I kind of stumbled in, and God just helped me see one day that there's a purpose for you going to grad school at Baylor, and it's not just to get this master's degree. It's actually to bring life to this campus. At the time, Baylor was the largest Baptist college university in the world. I think it still is. There was religion everywhere you turned, but there wasn't a lot of Jesus in the mix, and there's a big, big difference. And I'd been doing some summer internships with some college kids in Houston, a lot of whom went to Baylor, and they were like, man, you're coming to grad school. Let's keep this going. And I was like, oh, wow, God has a purpose. And what I learned in that moment, I still believe it today, is that the college moment, the university moment, as we call it, it's the crossroads of life. It's where people make the decisions about what career they're going to end up in, what their friend group is going to be, the trajectory of their life and values, because everything up to that point is incubated in family, in church, and whatever those moorings are. But once you set foot on that university campus, all that is up for grabs. And the first time a philosophy professor or an English lit professor undermines your faith, and the first time you realize, well, I can stay out as late as I want, I have no accountability, my parents will never know, I can make whatever choices I want to make, I can ditch this thing called church because my family isn't here to load up the car and go to the early service. And once you hit that crossroads, you have to answer the question, is this my faith, or was this my parents' faith, or my youth pastor's faith, or my family's faith? And it is the most critical question that any of us ask in life. And I think it's a great question to ask, and people want to know, am I just a believer because I grew up in Louisiana? Is that why I believe all this? What if I'd grown up in Delhi, or I'd grown up in Taipei? What would I believe? And I think to step back and evaluate faith, it's always going to lead us back to truth, and that's always going to lead us to Jesus. But I think asking the questions is amazing, and I saw a lot of kids who I knew they were raised in faith, but they checked it at the door because it really wasn't genuine in the first place. It wasn't theirs. They never owned it. And to stand at that crossroads, even in the early days at Baylor, and to introduce people to Jesus, reintroduce them to Jesus, and to call them up to a life of following him, we found, A, that it was so fulfilling for us, but B, that God was on it. The ministry we started at Baylor had a tenth of the population of the campus coming on a Monday night to a Bible study where we just opened God's Word and worshiped him together. This is 1985, 86, 87, 88, before even worship was what it is today. And that eventually morphed into passion through some very crazy circumstances again. But it's the critical time in life, and to be able to serve and to pour into these young people, to only ask of them that they commit their lives fully to God's purposes, but to ask nothing for ourselves from them, and to serve them, believe in them, champion them, and challenge them. This is the great calling in life, and it's worth all of us believing in and all of us investing in.
It's awesome. We're talking to Louie Giglio here. He is the author of Goliath Must Fall, Winning the Battle Against Your Giants. Stay tuned at the end of this podcast because we're going to give away a copy of this book and tell you how you can win a copy of this new book by Louie Giglio. But Louie, I want to just talk about the book for a second and why you wrote it. Why write this book, Goliath Must Fall, right now?
Well, we, at Passion City Church, we have the privilege of walking through life with people. And one of the things when you walk through life with people is you realize there are a lot of giants still in the land. And this story, everyone knows, the greatest underdog story of all time, maybe one of the greatest stories of all time, most loved stories of people in the whole world. This little shepherd boy, 15-year-old, going up against this undefeated champion, 9.5 foot tall behemoth, this Philistine warrior called Goliath. But the reality is you don't have to go back several thousand years to find a giant story. All we have to do is just look up. And giants like anger and addiction, rejection, fear, anxiety, they're standing in our story right now. And so what we tried to do in the message series that we did here at church, which eventually turned into the book, Goliath Must Fall, is that we wanted to help people see the radical truths in the book. So I'll just give it to you if you're not ever going to read the book. And it is this, that a lot of us were raised thinking that we were David in the story of David and Goliath. And if we got our rocks together and got our sling and went out and took good aim and really committed ourselves, that we could take down whatever it was we faced in life. But the reality is that we're not David in the story of David and Goliath. We're not the giant slayer. Jesus is David in the story of David and Goliath, and Jesus is the hero of all of Scripture. So in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Psalms and Proverbs and the Gospels and in the epistles and Revelation, Jesus is the main character. So you have to ask, where is he in the story of David and Goliath? Well, we know he's not the Philistines, he's not Goliath, he's not Saul, he's not the Israelite army. He must be David in the story of David and Goliath. And so it helps us when we shift our focus from, I've got to bulk up and hulk up so I can take down my addiction, to say, no, Jesus has already done everything necessary to defeat this addiction that wants to take control of my life. I've just got to walk in, appropriate the finished work and power of Jesus to experience the victory in my life. And so we say that our freedom and God's glory are intertwined together. That's why the giants in our lives must fall. And it's been extraordinary and incredibly encouraging, humbling, watching people discover the power of God, the finished work of God, and knowing that he's already done enough. And, you know, what we say in the book is that, yeah, your giant may be big, but it's not bigger than Jesus. And so if we lift our eyes a little higher than the giant, we'll see a God who's big enough and strong enough to set us free from whatever it is that has a hold on us in our lives.
I love what it says in the back of the book. Fix your eyes on the size of your God, not the size of your giant. It's that simple, right, Louie?
Well, you know, David, before this time, they say David was 15, maybe 16 when he came into the Valley of Elah. Came to visit his brothers and resupply them, but, you know, they were just stuck on the hillside for 40 days and 40 nights being intimidated by this giant. When David walks in, he's 15, 16 years old, but before that, even when he was younger, David was already tending his father's flock, and it could have been there that he wrote a psalm like Psalm 8 when he said, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." And then he went on to say, "When I consider the heavens, the moon and the stars, the work of your fingers, then who am I that you are mindful of me?" And so David already had a galactic view of God. He knew God as a creator of the universe. So when he walks into this valley and he sees this giant, of course the giant's intimidating.
Right.
But he's only 9.5 feet tall, and that's not as big as a God whose hands and fingers created the stars and the galaxies. And so David had a bigger view. And I think for us, we talked about it in the series recently, it's like the London Eye, which we were in London just a few weeks ago. You get in on ground level, but in 30 minutes, you're at the apex of your journey. And you're 430 feet above the ground or something like that. And you're up above the Thames River. You're towering now over St. Paul's Cathedral and Westminster Cathedral. And you've got this incredible vantage point in a 30-minute journey. You've gone from street level to amazing level. And worship allows us, when we put our focus on God, when we remember who he is and what he's done in the past, when we lock onto his promises for the future, it's like getting on the London Eye. Worship takes us from street level up to the apex point. And we see the same things as we saw when we were at street level. We just see them from a completely different vantage point. And I think David walked in looking down on that giant, and all those other fighting men were looking up at that giant. And that's what worship allows us to do. And that's why, you know, we always say the antidote to fear isn't really courage. The antidote to fear is faith. And the soundtrack to faith is worship. And so if you've got a giant in your story right now, you got to get your eyes back on God and get that soundtrack playing of the worship of God. And that allows us to have a different view and a different perspective on what we face.
A couple more minutes here on the podcast with Pastor Louie Giglio. And Louie, you know, there's this perception out there from people, I think, that pastors, influential leaders, you know, influential people like yourself, they have it all figured out. They always have all the answers and everything's going just wonderful and dandy. But for you, Louie Giglio, what has been your biggest struggle?
We're living on a different level. Let's just be honest. We have a different relationship with God. No struggles, no pain, no heartache.
Yeah, exactly,
and,
right?
It's wonderful. It really is wonderful. And I wish I could explain it to you, but you wouldn't fully understand. You know, it's funny. I had a conversation with one of my family members this past week, and not immediate family, but one of our family, and I was telling him about some of my struggles. And interestingly, at the end of the conversation, they said, "Thank you so much for sharing that with me. It just makes me feel so much better." And I was like, well, that doesn't make me feel great that you just said that. And I think what they were saying, honestly, was people have a tendency to put pastors on a different level. And the reality is we're all the same, and everyone knows that. And yes, I have a calling and a gifting to do my best to serve people and open God's Word and call people up to great faith. But, a few years ago, I write about it in The Comeback and explain more about it in Goliath Must Fall. I ended up in a pit of depression, anxiety, doom, dread. I was out of commission, Jason, for a few months in life. Didn't leave the house for weeks and weeks. Could not function at all on any level, and just got in a really difficult, dark place. And I don't know really how it happened, and I can't explain fully how it stopped happening, other than the grace of God, help from a doctor. Worship was a big part of it, but I know what it's like to be down and out, and I would have never dreamed in that day, and I don't mean this, I'm not trying to be dramatic, but if you told me, 8 years ago, Louie, don't worry, God's going to bring you back, and you're actually going to be on the Sports Spectrum, podcast with Jason talking about faith, and you're going to be mostly in your right mind, and you're going to be filled with God's Spirit, I would have just looked at you and said, it'll never happen. I'm never going to get out of this hole. I'm never going to get out of this place. That's how far down I was. Mm-hmm. But here I am today by the grace of God. But it helps me, and our family has been through immense challenges. I've been through debilitating disease and death of both my parents. We've been through addiction. We've been through rehab. We've been through divorce. We've been through depression. We've been through it all. And I go through the same highs and lows and desert valleys that everybody else walks through. But that's the beauty of it. And I think, honestly, Jason, if you're willing to be vulnerable about that, it doesn't make you less of a leader. It actually makes you a better leader. And this same David that we're talking about, who took down this giant, you read through the Psalms, which is kind of the backstory of what he's feeling and experiencing in life, a lot of ups and a lot of downs. But the common thread is I have faith in a great Creator who is going to come through for me. And that's my message, and that's everyone's message. God takes what the enemy means for evil, and he uses it for good. And I'll never stop believing that, no matter what the story is in my life. And Paul even said, I've got this thorn. I wish God would take it away. We don't know if it was an ailment or a relationship, or we don't know what the setback was. We just know that God didn't want to take it away. Why? Because it was the vehicle that God used to remind Paul, this great man of faith, that it was God's grace that was going to be the sufficiency for him in all things. And so I, like Paul, rejoice in my weakness. I'm not trying to hide it or cover it up. I would like to grow in it, and if God did see fit to take it away, any of them that I have, that would be wonderful too. But if not, I choose to rejoice in the weaknesses, because when I am weak, then I am strong. And that's the story of God's grace in me, and that's the hope of God's grace in all of us.
Louie, we have one more question for you, and it's a question we ask all of our guests here on the Sports Spectrum podcast, and it's a simple one, but the answer isn't always simple. What has God been teaching you right now?
God has been really reminding me, teaching/reminding me that with a simple phrase, and it is, if I've done it once, I can do it again. If I've done it in the past, I can do it again. If I did it for Abraham, I'm that same God, Louie, I can do it again. And I think sometimes for me, Jason, I have these crises of faith where it's like, because we keep going up hills and mountains here. We are not on flat terrain. We keep coming up to these Everests that require faith and resources and staff and team that we don't have, and solutions that we can't easily see. Every month, it's a new hill. It's a new mountain in front of us. And if I'm not careful, I have a tendency to have a faith crisis every time, like, man, I don't know how this is going to work out, or I've got to figure out how to solve this, or I've got to come up with a solution. And it's God just reminding me, come with a lot more confidence than that. Why? Because I'm the same God who brought down the walls of Jericho. I'm the same God who parted the Red Sea. I'm the same God who preserved Daniel in the lion's den. I'm the same God who raised Lazarus from the dead. I'm the same God who raised up Jesus from the grave. And I'm the same God who provided for your world tour in 2008, the $6 million that you didn't know where it was going to come from so you could go around the world and reach college students. I'm the same God who has come through miraculously time after time after time. And if I've done it once, I'll do it again. And I think just living in that, especially the early part of this year, really was a game changer for me. And it saved me a lot of time and energy of asking God for things that I really needed to just be thanking Him for. And that's been a real present reality for me. There was a song actually by Elevation Worship we did in our church a lot in February, March, and April. And I bet some days through that stretch I listened to that. The song's called Do It Again. I probably listened to that song 5 times a day for 2 months during that stretch, just as the soundtrack, because I'll say it one more time, we create the soundtrack to our lives, and it can be Jason Aldean. Yeah, that's great. That's fine. But if that's the only soundtrack you're creating every day, you're probably not stepping into the fullness that God has for you in life. And that's no knock on Jason or anybody else. I love all kind of music. But you and I are responsible for creating our soundtrack. And we've got to choose carefully what we want playing in the background and in the foreground, because it's going to dictate the way we think and proceed. Just like every athlete's got that song, they're in their cubicle or in their locker or walking up to the starting platform, and they've got the earphones on and they're listening to that thing, that one song. And I'm not saying it always has to be a song of faith, but man, if you got some Tasha Cobbs going right before you tee it up, I guarantee you're going to be in the right frame of mind when you get there. And I think we're responsible for creating that soundtrack. What music's playing in the background and what music's playing in the foreground? And is it reminding us of God's great faithfulness, or is it just motivating us to go out and do our best? And I think if it is reminding us of God's faithfulness, that's the best motivation for us to go out and do our best. And that's what I've tried to live in for the last few months of this year.
He is Louie Giglio, pastor of Passion City Church in Atlanta, diehard Auburn Tigers fan, and he's author of his latest book, Goliath Must Fall, Winning the Battle Against Your Giants. It's in bookstores now. Stay tuned. I'm going to tell you right after the podcast is over here how you can win a copy of Louie's new book. Louie, thank you so much for being a part of the show and being our guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast.
Real pleasure for me, Jason. Thanks for having me, and War Eagle.
War Eagle indeed. Louie Giglio loves him some Auburn University Tigers, and we do appreciate Pastor Louie being a guest here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And as we mentioned, we are giving away a copy of his brand new book, Goliath Must Fall, Winning the Battle Against Your Giants. This book is just awesome. So I'm excited for you to have a chance to win it. Here's how you can get your chance to win a copy of this book. Simply go to iTunes and leave a review of this podcast, this specific podcast, episode number 20 with Louie Giglio. Mention Louie's name in the review. When you leave a review, you mention his name, you're automatically entered. And what we'll do is we'll put the names in a hat, we'll draw out a name, and maybe even draw out a second name. We'll see. I got to get permission from Louie to give away a second copy of his book, but we like to be generous here at Sports Spectrum. So leave a review on iTunes. Mention Louie Giglio's name, mention the podcast. Even if it's a bad review, we want to hear from you. Hopefully it's a good review and you like the interview, but if it's a bad review, that's fine too. We want to hear from you. And then if you leave your name and mention Louie Giglio in the review, you are entered. And then we'll announce the winner either the next podcast, which will be Major League Baseball umpire Ted Barrett, or the podcast after that, which we expect to be Mercy Me's drummer, Robbie Schaefer. So we have a bunch of great content coming up, a bunch of great podcasts coming your way, and we want to give back. So this is an easy way to give back and win a copy of Louie Giglio's wonderful book, Goliath Must Fall. Thank you so much for joining us here on episode 20 of the podcast. We will see you next time on the Sports Spectrum podcast.